too often to detail the atrocity of ambition, the malignity of revenge, and the desperation of jealousy. But the perpetrators are generally confined to the abandoned and irreligious, the illiterate and intemperate. Their follies or former crimes account in some measure for their delinquency, and we lament their want of virtue and education. But when we meet in the criminal catalogue with a culprit like the present, a man of education and a minister of the gospel, guilty of a premeditated murder, the murder of his own pupils, the sons of his benefactor, the soul recoils with horror, and we shudder at the want of religious principle evinced in the deed, and this criminal subsequently avowed himself an atheist. The Reverend Thomas Hunter was born in the county of Fife in Scotland, and was the son of a rich farmer who sent him to the University of St Andrew for education. When he had acquired a sufficient share of classical learning, he was admitted to the degree of the Master Arts and began to prosecute his studies in divinity with no small degree of success. Several of the younger clergymen act as tutors to wealthy and distinguished families till a proper period arrives for their entering into orders, which they never do till they obtain a benefice. While in this rank of life they bear the name of chaplains, and in this station Hunter lived about 2 years in the house of Mr. Gordon, a very eminent merchant, and one of the bailies of Edinburgh, which is a rank equal to that of the alderman of London. Mr. Gordon's family consisted of himself, his lady, 2 sons and a daughter, and a young woman who attended Mrs. Gordon and her daughter, the malefactor in question, some clerks, and menial servants. To the care of Hunter was committed the education of the 2 sons, and for a considerable time he discharged his duty in a manner highly satisfactory to the parents, who considered him as a youth of superior genius and great goodness of heart. Unfortunately, a connection took place between Hunter and the young woman, which soon increased to a criminal degree, and was maintained for a considerable time without the knowledge of the family. One day, however, when Mr. and Mrs. Gordon were on a visit, Hunter and the girl met in their chamber as usual, but having been so incautious as not to make their door fast, the children went into the room and found them in such a situation as could not admit any doubt of the nature of their intercourse. No suspicion was entertained that these children would mention to their parents what had happened, the eldest boy not being quite 10 years of age, but when the children were at supper with their parents, they disclosed so much that left no room to doubt what had passed. Hereupon the female servant was directed to quit the house on the following day, but Hunter was continued in the family, after making a proper apology for the crime of which he had been guilty, and attributing it to the thoughtlessness of youth, and promising never to offend in the same way again. From this period he entertained the most inveterate hatred to all children, on whom he determined in his own mind to wreak the most diabolical vengeance. Nothing less than murder was his intention, but it was a considerable time after he had formed this horrid plan before he had an opportunity of carrying it into execution. Whenever it was a fine day, he was accustomed to walk in the fields with his pupils for an hour before dinner, and in these excursions the young lady generally attended her brothers. At the period immediately preceding the commission of the fatal act, Mr. Gordon and his family were at their country retreat very near Edinburgh, and having received an invitation to dine in that city, he and his lady proposed to go thither about the time that Hunter usually took his noontide walk with the children. Mrs. Gordon was very anxious for all the children to accompany them on this visit, but this was strenuously opposed by her husband, who would consent that only the little girl should attend them. By this circumstance Hunter's intention of murdering all the 3 children was frustrated, but he held the resolution of destroying the boys while they were yet in his power. With this view he took them into the fields and sat down, as if to repose himself on the grass, and was preparing his knife to put to the lives of the children at the very moment they were busied in catching butterflies and gathering wild flowers. Having sharpened his knife, he called the lads to him, and when he reprimanded them for acquainting their father and mother with the scene with which they had been witness, said that he would immediately put them to death. Terrified by this threat, the children ran from him, but he immediately followed and brought them back. He then placed his knee on the body of one while he cut the throat of the other with his penknife, and then treated the second in the same inhumane manner. These horrid murders were committed in August 1700 within half a mile of the castle of Edinburgh, and, as the deeds was perpetrated in the middle of the day and in the open fields, it would have been very wonderful indeed if the murderer had not been immediately taken into custody. At that very time a gentleman was walking on the castle hill of Edinburgh, who had a tolerably perfect view of what had passed. Alarmed by the incident, he called some people who ran with him to the place where the children were lying dead. Hunter now advanced towards the river with a view to drown himself. Those who pursued came up with him just as he reached the brink of the river, and his person being immediately known to them, a messenger was instantly dispatched to Mr. and Mrs. Gordon, who were at that time going to dinner with their friends, to inform them of the horrid murder of their sons. Language is too weak to describe the effects resulting from the communication of this dreadful news. The astonishment of the afflicted father, the agony of the frantic mother, may possibly be conceived, though it cannot be described. According to an old Scottish law, it was decreed that, if a murderer should be taken with the blood of the murdered person on his clothes, he should be prosecuted in the sheriff's court and executed within 3 days of the commissioned fact. It was not common to execute this sentence with rigour, but this offender's crime was so aggravated a nature that it was thought most proper to remit anything of it to the utmost severity of the law. The prisoner was therefore committed to gaol and chained down to the floor all night, and on the following day the sheriff issued his precept for the jury to meet, and in consequence of their verdict, Hunter was brought to his trial, where he pleaded guilty, and added to the offence he had already committed the horrid crime of declaring that he lamented only not having murdered Mr. Gordon's daughter as well as his sons. The sheriff now passed sentence on the convict, which was to the following purpose, that on the succeeding day he should be executed on a gibbet, erected for that purpose on the spot where he had committed the murders, but that previous to his execution his right hand should be cut off near the wrist, then he should be drawn up to the gibbet by a rope, and when he was dead, hung in chains between Edinburgh and Leith, the knife with which he committed the murders being struck through his hand, which should be advanced over his head and fixed therewith to the top of the gibbet. Mr. Hunter was executed, and in strict conformity to the above sentence, on the 22nd of August 1700. But Mr. Gordon soon afterwards petitioned the sheriff that the body might be removed to a more distant spot, as its hanging on the side of the highway through which he frequently passed tended to re-excite his grief for the occasion that it had first given rise to. This requisition was immediately complied with, and in a few days the body was removed to the skirts of a small village near Edinburgh named Broughton. It is equally true and horrid to relate that at the place of the execution Hunter closed his life with the following shocking declaration: "There is no God. I do not believe that there is any, or, if there is, I hold him in defiance." Yet this infidel had been regarded as a minister of the gospel. A few serious and important reflections will naturally occur to the mind on pursuing this melancholy narrative. Mr. Hunter was educated in a manner greatly superior to the vulgar, and he was of a profession that ought to have set an example of virtue instead of a pattern of vice. Yet neither his education nor profession could actuate as preventative remedies against a crime the most abhorrent to all of the feelings of humanity. His first offence, great as it was, could be considered as no other than a prologue to the dismal tragedy that ensued, a tragedy that was attended with almost every possible circumstance of aggravation, for Mr. and Mrs. Gordon had done nothing to him that could tempt him to any thoughts of revenge, and the children were too young to have offended him, even in intention. They simply mentioned to their parents a circumstance to them that appeared somewhat extraordinary, and which Mr. Hunter's character and situation considered was indeed of a very extraordinary nature. Yet in revenge of this supposed affront did he resolve to imbrue his hands in the blood of the unoffending innocents. If we reflect on the conduct of Mr. and Mrs. Gordon in discharging the young woman who was guilty of the violations of the laws of decency, and retaining their family the principal offender, we must own that their partiality was ill-founded. This, however, must be ascribed to the veneration in which the clergyman are universally held, and the particular regard for that shown towards them in Scotland at the commencement of the last century. Still, however, it is an aggravation of Hunter's crime, who ought to have been grateful in his proportion as he was favoured. It is a shocking part of Hunter's story that he was one of society of abandoned young fellows who occasionally assembled to ridicule the Scriptures, to make a mockery of being the attributes of God. Is there any wonder so that this wretch fell as an example of the exemplary justice of divine providence? Perhaps a fate no less dreadful attended by many of his companions, but their histories have not reached our hands. There is something so indescribably shocking in denying the existence of God, in whom we live, move, and have our being. That is amazing. Any man who feels that he did not create himself can be an atheist.